Hello, welcome back. Continuing our discussion of interest groups and lobbyists, let's move on to the revolving door. Revolving door lobbyists are a special class of lobbyists in Washington, D.C. and in our state legislatures. They consist of former lawmakers or their staff persons who retired and then became lobbyists. And they often attract very high fees for their services because they know a lot of people. Before we get to revolving door lobbyists, let's talk about some ideas about why lobbyists have a bad reputation. Revolving door lobbyists is one of those classes of lobbyists who a lot of people think of and have negative expectations about. And then we will also talk about why lobbying may not be all that bad as well. So lobbyists typically have a bad reputation overall. If we were to look at a list of occupations in America that are highly respected, that is, people rate them as having high honesty or ethical standards, we find that the top profession that people respect tends to be nurses, followed by military officers and grade school teachers. Now, if we go all the way to the bottom, you probably can predict what I'm going to tell you, that lobbyist is one of these professions that people do not respect. But are there any others who compete for the least respected profession in America? Well, members of Congress are very much not respected by a lot of people, or at least they don't expect them to exercise honesty and ethical standards, followed by car sales people, and then at the very bottom, lobbyists who get a 8% rating for high honesty and ethical standards. Why do people have such a negative view of lobbyists per se? Part of the reason is that people suspect that interest groups and their lobbyists are trying to influence policy in an anti-democratic manner. So, for example, we have voters in our electoral system who elect lawmakers who then presumably enact laws or policies on behalf of the voters. So those lawmakers should be representatives of the voters. However, elections occur only every 2 or 4 years, depending on the office, or every 6 years for the US Senate. And in between those elections, lobbyists may come in and try to influence elected lawmakers to try to steer them away from the preferences of voters and to try to steer them closer to the preferences of the lobbyists. This idea is often called the mobilization of bias, that lobbyists represent the business community, they have different preferences than the voters at large, and therefore lawmakers do not produce laws that represent voters whenever they are influenced by the lobbyists. One of the key ways to influence lawmakers these days is to hire what's called a revolving door lobbyist. These are people who were former legislators or members of Congress or staff persons at one time or another. These are often the best paid lobbyists. They represent a lot of clients on the Hill. Why is that? Because they have personal connections. They know who to talk to, and they know how to appeal to those people who are currently serving in office. And hiring these revolving door lobbyists, even though they cost more, has been shown to get you policy results more often in a state legislature or in Congress as well. So there are revolving lobbyists of all parties. Here, for example, we have the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, who has become a consultant for various lobby firms in Washington, D.C. And we have a former Senator, Tom Daschle, who was a leader within the Senate of the Democratic Party for quite some time. He also has become a healthcare lobbyist, or a lobbyist, and he works on healthcare. Now, why is it that these individuals can command so much influence? Because they know people in office. They know which staff persons deal with what issues, for example. They know the personal ambitions of members of Congress. They know the issues that members of Congress are concerned about, and so they know how to build an argument and how to appeal to those members of Congress. But also, it's not just their expertise, it is their connections or their personal relationships. They built relationships, professional relationships with members of Congress and their staff persons over years because they used to work with them when they, the lobbyists, served in office. And so in other words, these revolving door lobbyists have friends in high places. They know incumbent officials and they know how to lobby them effectively. Now, this raises a number of concerns about influence. If these lobbyists are the ones who cost the most and get results, then naturally the interest groups who can pay the most are the ones who command the most influence. There are several ways to try to correct this issue. One way is to have what's called a waiting period or a cooling off law, where a former member of Congress has to wait some amount of time before they can register to lobby. Right now, as a result of a law passed in 2007, former members of Congress have to wait 1 year before they may lobby. However, some members of Congress want the waiting period to be longer. For example, in January of 2019, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts proposed a lifetime ban on members of Congress working as lobbyists. This might very well slow down the revolving door, and it might help to alleviate the influence of business on American politics. However, many members of Congress who become lobbyists don't actually register. They provide consulting services to lobbyists. They tell them how to lobby, for example, and so that might be a loophole that any sort of lifetime ban would have to deal with. The states themselves have different waiting periods. Some states require that former lawmakers wait 2 years, for example. Other states require that former lawmakers wait just 1 year. About 39 states as of 2016 require lawmakers to wait some amount of time. And voters in Florida just approved a law requiring that former lawmakers wait 6 years, in fact, the longest in the nation. Now, of course, there are other ways that revolving door lobbyists might lose influence. Legislative turnover occurs whenever members of a legislature retire from office. After a major election, possibly an election where party control of the House or Senate switches, many more members will lose their seats or they will retire. Because revolving door lobbyists have friends in the legislature, legislative turnover is bad for them as lobbyists. It means that their friends are no longer serving in office. And it also means that their friends might also be competing with them for those lucrative lobby jobs within the Washington Beltway. So with more turnover, lobbyists lose valuable connections within the legislature. Those new legislators who come in for the first time often are hostile to lobbyists in general. They really don't trust them. Why? Well, like many of you and many of the survey respondents, I imagine, they had a negative perception of lobbyists to begin with. But over time, many legislators come to be friends or to develop professional relationships with lobbyists. Lobbyists can be helpful to legislators. To give you some examples of how connections are often lost as a result of legislative turnover. After members of the Democratic Party retook the US House in 2018, there were news stories that lobbyists had to target or solicit these newly elected lawmakers in Congress. Some newly elected state legislators in Florida as well refused to participate at fundraising dinners and other events hosted or organized by lobbyists. And even a new presidency can cause some lobbyists to lose business because they've lost connections within the executive branch. This last story from the Wall Street Journal tells the story of a very powerful lobbyist who knew a lot of people within the Obama administration, but after 2016, with the new Trump administration coming into office, he lost a lot of connections in the White House, and he lost a lot of business as well. So many people think that lobbying is bad and that the revolving door is also bad because it might skew policy outcomes away from what the voters want and more towards what big paying businesses might want as well. But there are some reasons to think that lobbying can be good. As we indicated in the last video, there are all kinds of interest groups, labor unions, trade associations, businesses, yes, but also membership groups like the ACLU and Sierra Club. Many of them, in fact, all of the ones that I have mentioned engage in lobbying. So lobbyists often represent different causes. And one thing to remember about lobbying that's very important that political scientists have noticed for years is that lobbyists tend to solicit or target the lawmakers who already agree with them. Lobbyists don't waste their time on lawmakers who are completely against their clients' interests. Why would they do that? Why would lobbyists focus on lawmakers who already support their cause? They do that because they provide valuable information or insight to those lawmakers to help them become more effective legislative advocates. Lobbyists target their legislative allies to provide them information or possibly to write bills and give those bills to the legislative allies so that those legislators can perform their jobs more effectively. This is known as a legislative subsidy. And lobbyists provide lots of policy information, especially in state legislatures that don't have a lot of staff support. Members of Congress have staff help to conduct research for them. They have the Library of Congress, the Congressional Research Service, the Congressional Budget Office, and other agencies to help them do their jobs. But state legislators don't have these things, so lobbyists often step up at the state level. And information is often desperately needed by new legislators who are elected to Congress or the state legislatures. So imagine if you are a new lawmaker and you were recently elected to a legislative assembly, you may not know all of the legislative rules and procedures or all of the existing policies and laws, but many lobbyists who represent causes that you agree with and who might have given or donated to your campaign to help you get elected, they will actually step up with this information and talk with you to help you to perform your job better and overcome that information gap. So lobbying may be bad in some respects, but it may also be good. It's more complicated than simply a revolving door of connections. Thank you.